I'm really excited to be doing this review because back in 2019 I reviewed the AOC 24G2U and I found it to be a fantastic budget Full HD 144Hz IPS panel, and still till this day gets my top recommendation. But we have its replacement, the AOC 24G2SPU. Now this model has got a 165Hz refresh rate and a few differences when it comes to its overall peak brightness. But of course we're going to talk about its gaming performance very shortly. Now it's worth bearing in mind that this model is very much available in a fixed stand and also a 27-inch variant. You can see from the table over here breaking down the differences. Now these models are not to be confused with the AOC 24G2SU, which has a flat VA panel that runs at 165Hz. I agree, it's very confusing, but nevertheless it's just something I thought to highlight because this review is not concentrating on the VA panel, but indeed the IPS panel instead. So to kick off, I do want to talk about its refresh rate, and quite frankly I think you'll be very hard pressed to tell a difference between 165Hz and 144Hz. Now this is of even more relevance because AOC has surprisingly included a DisplayPort 1.2 and two HDMI 1.4 inputs. The former is perfect, but the latter will limit you to Full HD at 144Hz. And yes, no matter what HDMI cable you're running or what your laptop or computer's HDMI port version is, you're going to be capped out at 144Hz. As such, if you want to achieve the highest refresh rate and resolution, you'll have to run over a DisplayPort input. Now with that in mind, it does bring us on to its input lag, and here I had it tested at 3.5 milliseconds, which is seriously impressive. Although some of the newer panels out there on the market do achieve a little bit lower at around 2.5 milliseconds, so it would be nice to see AOC actually optimizing it. Here, in comparison to its sibling, it's pretty much near on identical. While I didn't have an input lag figure, you'll be able to see reviews from Simon at TFT Central and also Adam at PC Monitors, and links will be down in the description below, which achieve a near enough score. Our testing methodology are pretty much identical, so it's worth bearing that in mind. Now, in terms of the real life scenario, what I will say is that when it came to Counter-Strike Global Offensive, its input lag was seriously impressive. It meant that my clicks were being registered and heads were being taken off, at least on CSGO Deathmatch. I must say I had no problems whatsoever in this department. So while its input lag is seriously impressive, what about when it comes to its response time? Now here you'll see a detailed breakdown, and this is a massive shout out to Andrew at TechTeamGB for creating the OSRTT tool, and also props to Simon from TFT Central for actually guiding me through it. Now here the average initial time is what you're going to be concerned about at 5.74 milliseconds, which is the average G2G time. Now here this is in its strongest preset, whereby the RGB overshoot is also minimal, which is seriously impressive. Now if you were to dial down the overdrive mode, so for example on terms of medium, weak or off, you can see that the average initial time seriously increases, and while the RGB overshoot doesn't change all that much because in its strongest mode preset it's still very impressive. Now this perfectly leads me on to the UFO ghosting test, and at 165Hz you can see that there's still minimal amount of overshoot in terms of its strongest mode preset. Now you might be wondering what on earth is boost mode. Now boost mode is a way of enabling the max MBR mode and also giving you the lowest motion blur, and you can see here from the UFOs themselves. Now, I would definitely suggest running the strong mode overdrive and then adjusting the MBR to your own level. So for example, from level 0 all the way to level 20. It gives you more incremental changes. The boost mode overdrive is kind of like a shortcut. And the reason I know this is because I talked to Adam at PC Monitors and also Simon at TFT Central, which pretty much confirmed this. So what I will say over here is that you'll probably want to ignore the boost mode overdrive and run it on terms of its strongest overdrive mode and tinker around with the MBR settings to your heart's content. Now the objective data is very useful, but what I'll say subjectively is that this monitor is absolutely fantastic when it comes to its response time. Indeed, in terms of its strongest overdrive mode, I noticed very little inverse ghosting, and frankly I could see myself using this monitor on higher level games on CSGO or for example Valorant. So yes, very much like the AOC 24G2U, its older sibling, this monitor can be used for hardcore FPS competitive gaming. Now if you don't consider yourself a hardcore competitive gamer, you might want to enable adaptive sync through the OSD. Now note this will disable MBR, so therefore you're not going to be able to benefit from lower motion blur, and therefore will also disable the option of selecting the boost mode overdrive. Nevertheless, here in this mode, I was able to test via my RTX 3080 via connected over DisplayPort, and I had no problems running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, and therefore I didn't incur any sort of black screen issues, tearing, or any sort of artifacts. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that this monitor is a G-Sync compatible monitor, not a G-Sync module monitor, so that's just worth considering. And of course, if you have an AMD graphics card, you will be able to run AMD FreeSync without any sort of hitches either. The overall FreeSync, or shall I say G-Sync range, is 48 all the way up to 165 Hz. Now, elsewhere, I should point out that this monitor does not accept an HDR signal, and despite it having sort of HDR emulation modes through the OSD, which kind of skew with the colors, it's effectively still an SDR image, which is quite a shame. This will be specifically of disappointment to console gamers out there, or part console gamers, or part PC gamers, because here the consoles would have been able to benefit from potentially better dynamic range. Nevertheless, over here, via console, if you are connecting up to this monitor, you'll be limited to Full HD at 120 Hz, and yes, the HDMI 1.4 standard will suffice for you guys. So this perfectly leads me on to the image quality of this 23.8 or 24-inch IPS monitor, and of course the same results could be drawn to the 27-inch variant. Now, here I had it tested via my calibrators, and the monitor does have an sRGB emulation mode which can be selected through the OSD. Here you can see that the gamut coverage sits at 98.7% and the gamut volume at 102.4%. The average delta sits at a staggeringly low 1.03 and a maximum of 2.29. Better still, the tested contrast ratio for an IPS panel is impressive at 1368, while its measured white point is seriously unbelievable at 6560 Kelvin at 100%, which is pretty much bang on to the actual target value. Also, the gamut curve in comparison to the 2.2 standard is also really close. Ultimately here, in terms of its sRGB color accuracy, it's very similar to its sibling, if not a little bit better. Now, through the OSD, you do have a few other modes that you can select, and you might want to do this, for example, on the user mode, because it'll allow you to adjust the brightness, and yes, we'll talk about that very shortly. Now, in terms of its user mode, I will show my settings further down in this review in the OSD section, but here you can see that the monitor does indeed have a wide color gamut. The gamut coverage does change in terms of sRGB, but also the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 modes also are skewed in terms of a positive way. You can see below here that the monitor does go above the sRGB standard, and while it doesn't quite exactly hit the DCI-P3 modes in terms of gamut coverage, it's still very impressive. Unsurprisingly, the average delta E at 2.76 and a maximum of 6.32 have increased, and therefore it's not as color accurate in comparison to the sRGB mode. As for the measured white point, it does also skew it all that little bit, whereby it's got 7010 Kelvin at 100%, and equally when it comes to its gamma curve. Ultimately, if you're a gamer, you're going to want to run it on its user preset, whereby it gives you a bit more of that eye-popping experience. If, however, you're an image editor or video grader, you're going to want to run it on terms of sRGB emulation mode due to that bettered color accuracy. The only problem, however, is that the brightness is locked at a whopping 402 nits, which I find quite ridiculous. Just to put that into perspective, the 400 nits is brighter than the peak brightness of its sibling, which was getting around 350 nits, and it's brighter than a lot of monitors out there on the market. I just wish that here AOC would give you the control of adjusting the brightness. Similarly here, I was actually disappointed to see that the minimum brightness doesn't get any lower than 118 nits, and therefore might be a little bit of cause for concern for those people that play in a dark room. Now, thankfully, on the flip side, the peak brightness at 448 nits is seriously impressive, and as for the max overdrive mode, in terms of boost mode, or indeed the max MBR mode, it runs at 130 nits, which is actually perfectly playable. Now, this perfectly leads us onto brightness uniformity, whereby on my tested panel it's actually pretty acceptable across the board. Of course, it is somewhat lottery after all. The same could be said about backlight bleed. I had no problems whatsoever in terms of the corners of my monitor, and I appreciate some people will actually not like any sort of backlight bleed, and if you are someone who falls in that category, you might want to look at a VA or TN panel instead. So moving on, we get onto the monitor's OSD that can be accessed through a set of awkwardly placed physical buttons found at the bottom right of the monitor. Nevertheless, the OSD section is very comprehensive. Now the contrast, you'll want to leave it at 50, brightness adjust accordingly as to what you like, and I would strongly suggest not enabling HDR mode. This does not enable HDR because it's not supported on this monitor, but just gives you a kind of sort of fake emulation of what HDR will look like. Now as for the color temperature, I would suggest user for gamers out there and leaving red at 50, green and blue at 49. Of course, as I did reference before, you do also have the sRGB mode, although you can see it will ramp up the brightness, so something to worth bearing in mind. And then you've got the other preset modes as well that you could use, but I would again suggest using on the user mode, so it gives you a bit of a sort of customization. You've got picture boost. If you want to enable that, it kind of brightens up a certain part of the image, and the OSD setup is pretty self-explanatory. You'll probably want to enable or disable USB over here, and also for your DP capabilities you want to make sure it's on the maximum level. Now over here you can see you have got DP 1.1 and 1.2, so again I would suggest running on DP 1.2. Now as for the game modes, I would definitely leave this disabled. The game mode gives you sort of preset modes which just plays around with the color accuracy and everything like that. I'd leave that disabled, but then play around with the other settings. Now over here you have got the overdrive modes. You have got strong, medium, weak, off, and you've also got boost modes. You can see a bit of flickering that will be apparent on my camera, but not be apparent with your own eyes. Now the boost mode is the equivalent of having MBR at its maximum level and with overdrive on strong. So frankly, if it was me, and as suggested by Adam at PC Monitors and Simon at TFT Central, I would leave it on overdrive strong and then play around with the MBR settings to your heart's content. Of course, you don't have to use MBR nor the boost mode overdrive if you don't want. It also does limit the peak brightness, as I did mention before. Now MBR, you have got 20 level increments, so again you can adjust that depending on the brightness that you want, and of course with 0 it has it fully disabled. Now the thing to worth bearing in mind over here is if you do enable adaptive sync, so for example NVIDIA G-Sync or AMD FreeSync, it will grey out MBR and also mean that the boost overdrive mode will no longer be available. You won't be able to flick through it. So it's just something to worth bearing in mind that you can't run these simultaneously, whereas a few of its competitors do offer that sort of function. Finally, in terms of extra, it's very useful to know the refresh rate and the resolution that you're running on, and then you can of course change the inputs directly from here as well. Now with the OSD and my settings out of the way, I should point out that this monitor has got two 2-watt speakers built in. They will suffice for basic Windows notifications, but if you're doing any sort of music or gaming, then you'll want to run a set of bookshelf speakers, a DAC, a headphone, or indeed a headset. Now it's worth bearing in mind here that the monitor does have a 3.5mm jack output, so therefore you can connect up your headphones via said jack directly into the monitor and output audio. Now this brings me on to its stand and design, and here I've got no complaints whatsoever, at least on the tested model, whereby it's got a fully ergonomic stand which provides height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. It is also very sturdy despite its somewhat lightweight plastic frame. Elsewhere, it's worth bearing in mind here that the monitor does have a 3-side borderless design, which definitely means that it will take less space on your desk, and it does also still retain that black and red sort of finish, which some people really disliked in my original AOC 24G2U review, so it's just something I thought to highlight yet again in this updated model. So with all of that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and here the AOC 24G2SPU is a fantastic budget 165Hz Full HD IPS monitor, and one that I can actively recommend. Indeed, here it does well across the board, and as such gets my Best Buy award. Now it's worth considering, however, that if you can find its predecessor, the AOC 24G2U, or the 27-inch variant or the fixed down models, you might want to consider them instead, because they can be found at a cheaper price. Now these models will not give the same sort of peak brightness of the newer model that's been replaced, however it does still give you a fantastic gaming performance both in terms of input lag and response time. The refresh rate is pretty much near on identical, 144Hz versus the newer 165Hz, and in terms of the overall sRGB color accuracy, the stand, the design and also the OSD. Now these models are still very much sought after and ones that I would still actively recommend, and as a result it depends as to when you're watching this video. If those older models have been phased out, then definitely just grab the newer model. If you are still contemplating between the two models because they're both readily available, then you just might want to weigh up the options in terms of if peak brightness is very important to you, then you might want to consider the new model over its predecessor. Now, hopefully that's all made sense, and if you've got any questions, definitely do ask me down in the comment section below. And if you've liked this independent detail review, definitely do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which are definitely appreciated. And if you've done that already, I just want to thank you in advance. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.